Last time, we broke down the Slim Shady LP and discovered that Eminem's first label form was already extremely powerful, armed with reality warping and enough chaotic energy to destabilize an entire small star. But that was just the beginning. Now, we enter the Marshall Mathers LP, the moment where Slim Shady evolved into something far more abstract. No longer just a violent alter ego, Eminem here becomes a force of nature, spitting verses that can manipulate millions, dismantle reality, and unleash lyrical violence at a scale previously unseen. This is where the power scaling gets serious. Today, we're breaking down every unholy feat, every instance of true power being shown, and every bar that proves Marshall Mathers in 2000 was a menace to both society and the multiverse. Welcome to Eminem Power Scaling, the Marshall Mathers LP. Before we begin, I don't know, Blaine helped out a lot with this vid, so if you want to go show them some love, we would appreciate that. We will begin obviously with the first track on the album, titled Kill You. Marshall on this track starts putting up some feats at around 33 seconds in, where he says this.
Put your hands down, bitch. I ain't gonna shoot you. I'ma pull you to this bullet and put it through you.
Marshall makes the claim here that he can shove a bullet cartridge through a person without using any sort of projectile weapon, only using raw strength, which just sounds pretty insane from the jump. But before I calculate it for y'all, let's go over a few factors that we need to establish before we can get any real calculations done. Firstly, let's assume that the bullet cartridge being used in this instance is a 9mm caliber bullet, which is a typical standard round for most common handguns. And our second factor we need is to determine the distance that the bullet needs to travel. We will assume that this person is having the bullet shoved around their chest or torso area, even down in their abdomen area. Either way, this would roughly equate to around 0.3 meters or 10 to 12 inches of thick skin and muscle tissue potentially that this bullet would have to travel through. So with all those factors in mind, let's break it down. We're going to go about calculating the energy exertion requirement for this feat, and we will start by using the formula for kinetic energy calculations and plugging in our numbers. So E equals 1/2 of mv to the second power, m being mass of our cartridge, which is roughly 7.5 grams, and then v being the velocity, which is the standard muzzle velocity that these bullets travel at, which is usually around 380 meters per second. And then we plug those in and calculate that out to a number around 541 joules of energy. But we aren't done. To convert this into a force exertion calculation, we will need to use this formula here. F equals E divided by D, where E is the amount of energy in joules we just calculated, and D being the distance of 0.3 meters that we took into account before. Plugging those numbers into the equation, we get our grand total of 1,805 newtons of force, bare minimum, that Marshall would be exerting here. With just this first strength feat, Marshall is already getting to a superhuman level of strength. And our next feat is even more outlandish than the last. Later in the same track, Marshall states this. With this statement, firstly, you could assume that this is only a figure of speech. Marshall is comparing the state of his life and how bad it is to the depiction of hell often represented by Christian literature. But he continues the statement and claims to have actual evidence of him going to hell, making his figure of speech statement actually have some weight behind it. So let's just take Marshall at his word and grant him having at least visited hell at some point. Going about scaling this sort of thing is obviously tricky for a number of reasons, but if we want to get smart about it, we can gauge something from this, and if not, at least walk away with the knowledge that Marshall can travel to the dimension of dead and return, with his physical form staying intact the whole time due to the extended claim of having done physical acts in hell, and bringing the evidence back to our world. But if you wanted some actual gauge of durability per se, you could say that Marshall potentially survived the grueling temperatures of the underworld, which is usually depicted as being as hot as the boiling point of sulfur, which is around 444.6 Celsius, or for my normal viewers, 830 Fahrenheit. I don't personally think this is the case, that Marshall walked through these literal hellish temperatures, but if you want to add this to the list of feats, I wouldn't be opposed. Moving on to the next track, Who Knew, we get our first feat at around 40 seconds in, where Marshall says this.
Take my fucking eyeballs out and turn them around.
Scaling this is a bit tricky, but here's what I got. If you want to say that there's simply some regenerative property that makes this possible, this is the most likely interpretation of this event. Actual durability scaling here isn't very possible due to us not having enough information to go off of. Another possibility you could grant Marshall here is him possessing some sort of Toon Force-like ability, such as Bugs Bunny and Popeye have, which could explain further feats down the line, but again, the most likely interpretation is that Marshall has some sort of superhuman regeneration and or pain tolerance that makes these sorts of feats no big deal for the guy. With no upper limit shown yet, we can only speculate on how far these abilities may go. Moving right on to the next track, The Way I Am, we got one small thing to go over before we get to the only feat in this track, which is actually a pretty big one. But first, on the track at around 1:15 in, Marshall says this.
And if you offend me, I'm lifting you 10 feet in the air. I don't care who was there and who saw me, just join.
At first I was going to go about this by calculating the strength required to do this, but then I realized, this feat doesn't have enough info to go off of. Hypothetically, me or you could do the same thing by just dragging someone up a ladder 10 feet in the air. I know that's a bit of a cop-out, but I just wanted to highlight the process that I go through about deciding what bar is going in as a feat and what isn't. So, with that out of the way, let's get to the real feat on this track, where in the chorus, Marshall Mathers raps his now popular bar,
And I am whatever you say I am.
100% conviction, 100% raw words displaying the true nature of this entity we are dealing with. This can be taken a number of different ways, but if you highball it to its utmost potential, this can be taken to mean that he is literally anything we say he is, meaning that I could say he is the supreme overlord of all existence in the whole quantumverse or whatever, and thusly it would be so. This has so many routes you could take it, and we will be taking it there. Marshall has millions of fans who all think of him at different levels of admiration, and there are those who consider Marshall to be some sort of god to them. So if we grant even this stipulation, the scaling already goes off the walls. Marshall here is conveying that anything we state he is, he actually is, whether hypothetical, based in reality, or what have you. This does lead into the no limits fallacy, as well as the paradox of the creator and the creation. If we grant Marshall the highest highball interpretation of this, then not only would he be these grand powerful things we compare him to, or is said to be, but also all the negative things as well. And even then, you could just claim now as you are watching this that Marshall is the weakest being in all existence, and it would have to be true. But how can he be the weakest but also be the most powerful at the same time? Well, that's where the paradox arises. But even beings like the true God are above these sorts of paradoxes. So again, if we granted Marshall the title of true God, then none of these fallacies or paradoxes would matter. Marshall would be considered the most powerful being in all of existence. Scratch that. Marshall is the most powerful being in all of existence. Therefore, I said it, it's true. All tying back into the bar itself. If you don't want to take this statement into consideration for the rest of the scaling, that is an acceptable interpretation as well, but for the sake of the video, we will be adding this feat and continuing with this in mind. Anyway, moving on to the next track, we come to the real Slim Shady, where the meta bars don't stop, and we get this once again outlandish statement where Marshall raps this.
And every single person is a Slim Shady lurking. He could be working at Burger King, spitting on your onion rings.
Marshall is saying here that every person is Slim Shady. No sugarcoating, verbatim, this is what he states. If every person is Slim Shady, then that means Marshall isn't just a guy. He is a universal constant, an omnipresent being whose essence lives within every individual in existence. That includes you, me, the new pope, your girlfriend, the guy at the gas station, your grandma, everyone. And they're not just influenced by Slim Shady, they are Slim Shady. Which makes Marshall not only omniversal in power from what we said before, but also omnipresent in form. Marshall Mathers with each feat is showing us the true power of this godlike character. He's no longer just a rapper, he's the narrative holding the multiverse together. This, along with his last feat, is painting Marshall to be some sort of entity above all speculation. Skipping a few tracks, we come to the song I'm Back. We get a few statements on here that give Slim a bit more onto his already insane scaling. Firstly, at around 30 seconds in, Marshall raps this.
Get rid of that 9, it ain't gonna help. What good's it gonna do against a man that strangles himself?
Here, Slim states that he has strangled himself more than once before, due to the use of the word strangles. However, when I try and look into this to confirm it, the definition for this word strangles shows up as this. I'm not really sure what to do with this information. Personally, I am assuming his use of the word strangles is meaning a plural of the word strangle, and strangle means to squeeze or constrict the neck of a person or animal, especially so as to cause death. So I interpret this as him saying he has killed himself at least once before and came back to life from that instance. meaning he would have at least some sort of invulnerability to asphyxiation, granting him a pretty good durability buff, or is simply a standard immortality, which seems more on par for what we've established so far. But if you want, you can take the words at face value by definition, and Eminem is weirdly mentioning some sort of horse disease he carries? I don't know. Anyway, a few seconds later, Marshall raps this.
I used to be my mommy's little angel at 12.
Obviously, this could be a figure of speech, but taken at face value, we will say he is saying he was a literal angel, giving him many abilities that standard angels possess, being interdimensional, having superhuman strength, and a whole list of other unnatural abilities that stem from this divine connection. And then, at around a minute and 45 seconds in on this same track, Marshall states this.
I take each individual degenerate's head and reach into it. And if he feeds into this shit, he's an innocent victim and becomes a puppet on the string of my tennis shoe.
Marshall says that he reaches into people's heads and looks at their thoughts essentially. He then says if he doesn't like said thoughts, he makes this person into a puppet on his shoelace? Firstly, from this statement we can determine Marshall is using some sort of telepathy of mind reading on a mass scale, possibly a fourth dimension awareness feat if he's perceiving abstract mental structures like thoughts as physical interchangeable objects. Not only this, but if Marshall reads your mind and doesn't like what he sees, he claims he can turn you into a puppet. This implies that he has complete mental dominion over at least mortal beings like a regular human, as well as being able to reduce sentient beings to a non-sentient object. Simply put, he can rewrite consciousness, suppress free will, and physically reconfigure people based on the judgment of thought alone. Skipping another few tracks, we come to the song Bitch Please 2, where we get something close to a feat from Eminem, but I will let you come to that conclusion alone. At 2 minutes and 30 seconds in, Marshall raps this.
Oh no, big slim dog, 80-pound balls, thick 6-inch long.
It's hard to say exactly what this means. You could potentially prove some durability from it due to the skin torsion of the weight of said balls, and Marshall being able to withstand that, or even if it affects him in general. But we would need to see the 80-pound balls in question to come to a definitive conclusion. So, for now, we will just move on to the last, but not least, of our statements and feats from this album. We come to the track, Under the Influence, where Marshall gives us this statement. At 20 seconds in, he raps this.
I'm Clint Eastwood in his mid-20s.
All we can gauge from this is that it is a consistent statement from Marshall, if we take into account some of the prior feats and statements. Nothing new is really granted here. Marshall is saying he's literally Clint Eastwood, which would be consistent with him saying whatever we say he is. And if everyone is him, and he says he is Clint, then it must be true. And that was the last feat we had on this album. From this album, we get quite the deviation of scaling from the last. While a lot of abstract scaling is held up, if not expanded upon, some of the more standard scaling does fall short here. For example, the highest AP or DC feat we get from this album is in the statement about the bullet, which does grant Marshall a superhuman level of strength, but pales in comparison to the same amount of energy that Slim Shady could produce. Durability is pretty much the same, interpreted immortality, and if not, some sort of invulnerability to things that would typically kill a normal person. The strangling thing, the eyeball thing. But where we do get a wide increase of spectacle from the last album is the abstract scaling Marshall lays out here. From admitting to being every person simultaneously, to claiming he is whatever we say he is, and a few other additions onto this cosmic scaling, we get a pretty high interpretation for this version of Eminem. At its highest, Marshall isn't just manipulating reality, he is the concept of reality itself. I am whatever you say I am. He is a self-aware plot device. This makes him boundless because he cannot be outwritten, he is what is written, thus transcends fiction and reality boundaries. This isn't just some sort of parallel between the two, this is narrative omnipotence. Every single person is Slim Shady. He is the collective consciousness of everyone. Every sentient mind is an extension of him. Thus, Slim Shady becomes a multiversal constant. He can reach into your thoughts and physically manipulate you into non-sentience if he is displeased. He is the strongest and weakest simultaneously, but he can be said to have the highest interpretation of whatever we say he is. This makes him paradox-proof. If something contradicts him, he simply reshapes it around him instead. Marshall is an outer-versal, hyper-narrative, godlike being who exists in all minds, cannot be defined, only observed, and whose very existence alters the shape of all that is. He is the paradox that disproves itself, the supreme overlord of all existence in the whole Quantumverse. He is Marshall Mathers. And there you have it, If you made it to the end of the video, maybe drop a like, and please tell me in the comments below if you want me to scale the next Eminem album, The Eminem Show, or what artists you want me to scale after we finish up with Eminem's stuff. Anyway, thank you for watching till the end, and I hope you have a good one. That's all I had to talk about. Take care.